Hello and welcome to this Centre for Policy Studies event on the future of populism. I'm John Ashmore, the editor of CAPEX, which is the media arm of the Centre for Policy Studies, and I am delighted to be joined by two illustrious American panellists for what is sure to be a fascinating discussion. We have, with the blue shirt and the headset, Thomas Frank. Thomas is a historian and the author of a great many books, including Listen Liberal, Pity the Billionaire, The Wrecking Crew, What's the Matter with Kansas, and most recently, The People Know, a History of Anti-Populism, which we'll come on to shortly. Thomas is also a former columnist at the Wall Street Journal and Harper's, and the founding editor of the Baffler, and he's joining us from just outside Washington, DC. Other panelist, who is also a columnist, is Joseph C. Sternberg. He is a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, where he writes the political economics column. He joined the journal in 2006, initially working in Hong Kong, covering China and Japan and editing the Business Asia column. And his main area of focus at the moment is macroeconomics, monetary and trade policy, and European politics. And his most recent book is called The Theft of a Decade: How the Baby Boomers Stole the Millennials' Future. So a nice low-key title there, Joseph. We're going to kick off with a discussion between us for about 40 minutes, and then about 20 minutes at the end of the event, you guys can send in your own questions. There's a panel at the bottom of your screen where you can do that. Please do try and keep them pithy. We usually get quite a lot of questions, and I'm not always able to accommodate them all. So if I don't ask your questions, apologies in advance, but I will do my best. So Thomas, do you want to kick us off? Because we talk a lot about so-called populism these days, usually as a kind of shorthand for a tub-thumping, rabble-rousing, pretty negative thing, particularly among left-wing journalists. But actually, the term populism originated somewhere entirely differently, not just different, but almost antithetical to the way it's seen now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the first thing I should mention is that in the UK, my book has a different title. It's called People Without Power. Yes. Yeah. It's quite all right, but it's anyhow. The book is about exactly what you just described. This sort of hostility to the word populism. And just for a little bit of my background, I grew up in Kansas City, on the Kansas side of that city. And for us, populism was something very different. It was a heroic movement. This was the last great third-party movement in American history. It was a left-wing farmer labor party. Didn't last long. It came up in the early 1890s and disappeared about 1897, 1898. So didn't last long. But the populist tradition remains something that Americans, I think, can be proud of. What fascinates me is the way the word's meaning has been completely inverted over the years since then. And so I wrote this book to do two things: to tell the original story of populism, which is exactly the opposite of the way the word is used today. To tell that story, to tell the story of how the word was inverted, and then to tell this fascinating story of what I call anti-populism, of people who have despised populism from 1891 right up to the present. And whereas the definition of the word populism has changed quite a bit over the years, anti-populism has remained almost exactly the same, to the point where you could substitute in editorials that were published in the year 1896 for editorials that were published yesterday, change a few of the names of the principal characters, but otherwise they would be exactly the same, with one big difference. As you mentioned today, anti-populism is a phenomenon of liberals, or as we say in America, liberals, as you would say, the left. Whereas in the 1890s, anti-populism was a phenomenon of the orthodox establishment right. The people who stood up for orthodox economics, the gold standard, the great institutions of American life, the people who, believed that the government should always take the side of employers whenever there was a strike going on, and government should be supportive of monopolies and that kind of thing. That's who are the anti-populists then. What is shocking is that both the right-wing anti-populists of 1896 and the liberal anti-populists of today use the exact same bill of, how would you put it, the same attacks on what they perceive as the politics of mob rule. And I want to just say in both cases, they are mistaken, both in 1896 and today. And I can go into the story in great detail if you want. It's actually a fascinating little chapter of American history, but I'll wait till you say that's the thing to do.
Okay. I mean, Joseph, do you think that this term is something that actually, voters in Western developed democracies actually recognize themselves? I mean, do people go around saying, I consider myself a populist? And is there a risk that we lump lots of people into this sort of populist tent, which are really quite different? So you end up with Boris Johnson and Donald Trump and, I don't know, Bolsonaro all being part of this apparently similar philosophy.
Well, I mean, what I think is interesting about that, I kind of have a problem with the use of the word populism in general. And that's one of the reasons why I thought Thomas's book was so interesting and so helpful on this, in the way that it traces the history of that term and points out the extent to which it tends to be kind of a content-free term if you're talking about politics these days, because use of that term doesn't really tell you anything about what people who either are self-identifying as populists or people who are identifying other people as populists. I mean, it doesn't tell you anything about the content of their ideology. In fact, we talk about having right-wing populists like Trump or left-wing populists like Bernie Sanders in the US. So, I mean, in a certain extent, really, I think that the term is only talking about the sense that, especially in a representative democracy, a political movement ought to be popular in order to be successful. So, I mean, in a certain extent, I think that some of these discussions only get traction to the extent that whichever politician or political movement you have identified as populist seems to be succeeding in a way that is surprising the people who think that it shouldn't be succeeding. And I mean, one of the things that I thought was interesting from Thomas's book is actually the way that some politicians themselves can actually recognize how positive this term can be. I mean, what I had not realized is that the term populist itself was coined by a political party, the People's Party in the 1890s in America, to try to claim for themselves a mantle of popular support. And I mean, I think there's an interesting question about how popular they were in the end, given that they didn't always succeed in getting their agenda over the finish line. But clearly being popular shouldn't be a problem in a democracy. It's kind of the point. So, I mean, from that perspective, I find these discussions a little difficult to have, especially right now in this contemporary period, because it can be so difficult to know what you're actually talking about.
Sure, I feel the same way about when, I mean, normally sort of left-wing critics bandy around the word fascism. It's really just a kind of shorthand for something they don't like. I mean, just coming back, Thomas, to what Joseph was saying there about the origins of populism, how it's not, it wasn't meant to be a dirty word at all when it came out. I mean, who do you see as today's heirs of the original type of politics that the Populist Party espoused when they first came out?
Great question. You're right, it wasn't supposed to be a negative term. It was the populists themselves that came up with it, and they thought they were doing something, they thought they were engaged in a very noble, political struggle. And by the way, I was able to pinpoint almost within a week when they invented the word. It was on a train between Kansas City and Topeka, Kansas. Kansas was the great, the sort of stronghold of populism in America. And the party had been called, its formal name was the People's Party, but they came up with this nickname that day in 1891, and it immediately took off. And they knew that they had a hunk of dynamite on their hands, of rhetorical dynamite. Almost immediately they started using it, and within a few years it had completely eclipsed the original name of the party, and people just referred to them as the Populist Party. And so they just straight up made up the word. their issues were, I mentioned that they were a farmer labor party, and their issues seem kind of quaint today, but they wanted currency reform. They wanted to get America off the gold standard. They wanted the government to nationalize the railroads, because the railroads at the time were sort of functioned as a natural monopoly. And, you know, farmers were particularly in the grip of railroad monopolies. And they wanted government programs for farmers. They also wanted a bunch of electoral reforms. They wanted votes for women. They wanted the secret ballot. They wanted to make democracy more democratic, or to make our system, I should say, more democratic in a whole bunch of different ways. And what is fascinating is that about them is that their critique of American life, if you go back and read in their by the way, the idea of that they were racist demagogues is completely false. These guys were the opposite of that. It was the Democratic Party at the time was the main sort of bulwark of the racist system in America. But we'll talk about that some other time. Their larger critique of American society is that you had extraordinary concentration of wealth going on in the 1890s. You had incredible monopoly power, and you had political corruption. And their argument was that these three things went hand in hand. And we can clearly see, John, that that is the case today. I mean, it's very obviously, it's almost patently the case today with Silicon Valley, you know, sort of achieving a kind of, you know, monopoly power that the populists could never have imagined. And at the same time here in America, I don't know about the UK, but in Washington, we've essentially legalized bribery through our campaign finance system. And there's an enormous amount of criticism of this that goes on. Donald Trump himself talked about it all the time. And of course, the concentration of wealth is growing by leaps and bounds. So in my understanding of the populist tradition, you know, it's a very powerful strand in our democratic tradition. And you see it in its sort of full flowering in the 1930s in America, when the rest of the world, or a big part of the Western world, was turning against democracy. America really embraced popular democracy. And you had President Roosevelt with the New Deal, which is our term for the welfare state and the regulatory state. At the same time, the labor movement was taking center stage in American life. And you also had this form of art that was very, very populist, very much about the vernacular of the common man. It was the decade of the common man in the 1930s. Who is the bearer of that tradition today? The most obvious one, I would say, is Bernie Sanders. And I think he would probably agree that he falls in that tradition, in that vein. But I like to think that Black Lives Matter, you know, this protest movement that we're seeing, is sort of that's against police brutality, has a very good chance of becoming a populist movement. And I say that the reason I say that is because populism was obsessed with economic issues, with issues of social class. And the idea was to bring together people from all the different racial and sort of racial backgrounds in pursuit of a working class agenda. And Black Lives Matter could very well take that next step. I mean, they talk about it all the time. And I think it's just a matter of time until they turn their focus to economic issues. And then you will see the real deal in full effect.
I mean, Joseph, what do you think? I mean, who do you think has the kind of policies that would actually work for the majority of people? I know that you're skeptical about the sort of Sanders approach, embodied as well by Jeremy Corbyn over here, which is essentially to kind of offer people stuff paid for out of their own pockets in the future.
Well, so look, I'm actually going to kind of answer that question by dodging it a little bit, because I think this is, to me, this is getting into one of the real problems that we have with a lot of these discussions about populism, which is this question of how popular these movements actually are. I mean, you know, Thomas has pointed to some, policy changes, that started in America in the 1930s that seem to be conceptually related to what the populists were, pushing for in the 1890s. But I mean, by that point, you were a generation or two later. The circumstances were very different. Some of the arguments in favor of and against these policies were very different. And I'm not sure I would necessarily draw a straight line there. And I mean, if you're going to talk about, heirs to populist movements, I mean, some of the people who Thomas cited, like Bernie Sanders, have turned out not to be popular. I mean, Bernie can't even win a primary within the main left-wing party within the United States. And I think that this is an interesting feature of this discussion for me, which is the fact that, although we talk about these populist movements representing these upswells of popular opposition to, elite politics or something like that, it isn't always clear how popular these are. I mean, Donald Trump lost the popular vote in 2016. I mean, rather ironically, he is only the president thanks to a institutional quirk, the Electoral College, which is supposed to prevent majoritarian rule. The supporters of the People's Party, most famously William Jennings Bryan, who Thomas talks about in his book, I mean, he lost the 1896 election, for which he is most famous for that Cross of Gold speech that he delivered. So, I mean, I think that you have kind of two problems when you think about this issue. I mean, one thing that I think Thomas and I would probably agree with is that you do have to take these voters seriously, and understand that there are large numbers of them. A significant minority of voters might support some of these movements, and a healthy democracy has to account for that. But I also think that you have to be wary of overstating some of the significance, and maybe we shouldn't be necessarily thinking directly about who is the heir of a populist movement who can capture that degree of public support, when in the past that degree of public support wasn't actually enough to get you over the finish line.
I just picked up on a phrase you used there, which I think might be more useful as a kind of taxonomy, which is kind of anti-elite politics, rather than just calling it all populist. I mean, and we have a question here. I wasn't going to do any questions until the end, but we have a question here from John Redwood, who you may know as an MP, used to be a government minister here, and he has written a book called We Don't Believe You, about this phenomenon. And he asks, isn't the unifying divining point that modern populists are skeptical of the views of the global elite, international quangos and so on, and big government, and don't like sort of top-down projects? And do you think that's a helpful way of putting it that maybe makes it a little bit clearer?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there is something to that, and the skepticism about elites. And I think that what these political movements, whether you call them populist or something else, can tell you is that rifts are opening up within your politics or within your society between various groups of people that you need to be able to manage in some way in order to have a functioning society. I mean, I think that a healthy democracy leaves a lot of scope for a lot of debate about a lot of things, but you do also have to be alert to times when different bits of your polity seem to be moving in diametrically opposed directions, and you have to come up with some way of managing that. And I do think that there is a rebellion on the part of a non-trivial number of voters against the direction that some of these political figures are trying to take us.
Yeah, and Thomas, this is something you talk about in your book, which is that elites seem almost incapable of actually discussing their own failures. So you'll get endless grants.
Yes, isn't that fascinating?
You get endless grants about the problem of populism, but very few about examining elite failure.
Yes, this is a subject that has come to really fascinate me over the last few years, ever since the Obama presidency. By the way, so the idea anti-elitism is an extremely powerful element in American political life, and this is. That's a component of populism, but that is not by itself it. Populism is this very specific sort of economic critique, et cetera. But anti-elitism is, you go back to Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Newt Gingrich. These guys have used anti-elitism to extraordinary effect in American life. The culture wars in our country are all about anti-elitism. And what fascinates me is the way that the Democrats and the elites writ large constantly walk right into the critique with completely, you know, have no idea what they're doing, you know, and what you just pointed out is this is a subject that is, like I said, has come to obsess me. There's all of this writing about populism, this hand wringing about so-called populism, you know, this gnashing of teeth, and that the people are don't believe elites anymore. And but in this literature, and I've read enormous amounts of it, and they have conferences, you know, and they have academic departments even dedicated to this idea. They never look in the mirror. And they never say, well, what about elite failure? Let's go out and study that rather than studying the outrages of populism. Let's go out and study elite failure, because this is actually a fascinating subject. Why do elites fail? These highly educated people, why do they keep screwing things up? And this came to fascinate me after Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, and I had been a supporter of him. He had been a professor at the University of Chicago, where I was a graduate student. I had met him. I had enormous respect for him. I thought he was a brilliant man. And he comes in, he becomes president. And, you know, this is great news, right? He's president of the United States at this moment, at this maximum moment of crisis. You remember the global financial crisis? And he brings in this team of geniuses. Do you remember this? His first cabinet, which is all these guys, you know, he had the president of Harvard University advising him on economic policy. He had guys with genius grants. He had guys with Pulitzer Prizes. He had he wasn't the only Nobel laureate in the government. It was extraordinary. And these guys proceeded to continue the bailout policies of the Bush administration, basically unchanged. And they never prosecuted a single elite banker. They never even, you know, they never broke up any of those banks that they were bailing out, not even Citibank. They didn't even fire any of these guys. I mean, they didn't do anything to them. It's extraordinary. And I was watching this happen with my jaw hanging open. It's like, how could, you know, because ordinary homeowners were losing their houses if you lied on your mortgage, the FBI was after you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there was no accountability for these guys on top. And I was absolutely puzzled by that. I mean, puzzled. I was dumbstruck, you know, it was astonishing. And I wrote a whole book about it. Well, it started from that point. It was called, well, hell, I don't have it here with me, but it's called Listen Liberal. It did come out in the UK. You can get a copy of it. And basically what you start realizing real quickly is that the Democratic Party in America, which is the more left of our two parties, doesn't understand itself as a party of, as a populist party, as a working class party anymore. That's not who they are. They understand themselves as a party that answers to the sort of white collar professional elite. And as such, they saw these guys on Wall Street, and then to a certain extent, these guys in Silicon Valley, and these guys in big pharma, and these guys in the insurance industry. They saw them as constituents. They saw them as friends, as classmates. And I mean that in both senses of the word. These were colleagues. These guys and so they would say things like, you know, these guys, they made one mistake. We're not going to prosecute it. We're not going to send them to prison for one mistake. Or they'd say things. There's this notorious remark by one of the leading figures in the Obama Justice Department on why he was refusing to prosecute these guys. And he basically said, because banks are a special industry and they can't be held accountable. The financial industry is essentially above the law. I mean, it blows my mind that anyone could say that in America. And of course, that's, you know, as far away from the populist tradition as you can get. But what's also funny, I mean, and by the way, John, you got to tell me to shut up, because otherwise I will just blab. I will just blab.
All right. Yeah.
All right. Should I keep going? Because I have one more funny anecdote.
I'm just going to bring in. You can finish your point.
Well, the hilarious thing is like, this is about as anti-populist as you can get, right? What the Obama people were doing. But at the same time, the Republicans had hitched their star to a very anti-elitist movement called the Tea Party movement, which you might recall. And but it was anti-elitist in an extremely deceptive way. You know, they were saying, let the failures fail. And it sounded like they were talking about Citibank, but in fact, they were talking about individual homeowners. And just to make this, to give everybody in the audience a good laugh, back in the populist days, the number one enemy of like farmers in Kansas was commodity traders in the pit in Chicago. Do you know what I mean by that? Yeah, of course. You know, you guys are highly educated, work for the Wall Street Journal. You know what that is. The commodity brokers in Chicago. These were the farmers' worst enemy in the world. Okay. The Tea Party movement, you know, the great sort of pseudo populist effort of our time, was launched from the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade by a bunch of commodity brokers. It always cracks me up anyhow.
So these things are a way of mirroring themselves, I think. I just want to come back to them, because Joseph, your book is about the aftermath of the financial crisis. And it strikes me that a lot of the eruptions we've seen then are kind of long-awaited reckoning for a lack of what Thomas was talking about there, a kind of lack of justice at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is definitely an element of that. But I mean, one of the things I was interested in, and you know, this is something where I would push back a little bit at the way that Thomas was just characterizing the situation after the financial crisis, because I think there was definitely this element of back scratching between the political class and certain corners of the economy, particularly the financial system. But I think that I would locate the cause for that in a somewhat different place from where it sounds like Thomas is putting the blame for that. I don't think it was necessarily the personal connections or the class consciousness between the you know, Wall Street executives and the officials within the Obama administration. I think it's this element of the fact that you can end up with a system of government where you have particularly industries like the financial system that become so tightly bound up in the state, you know, to the point where oftentimes, although we talk about the banks on Wall Street, you know, functioning as private enterprises that are fantastically, you know, profitable and making all of this money and getting away with murder whenever we have a crisis, in some other ways, they are often regulated almost like utilities in the, you know, sense of government mandates that they need to satisfy, or in the run-up to the financial crisis, the extent to which the financial system became a mechanism for affecting various housing policies that the, you know, government in a bipartisan way had been pushing, that contributed to causing the financial crisis. And when you have that kind of environment, the politicians are not going to be eager then to prosecute any of the bankers after the fact, because then that necessarily is going to reveal the, you know, closeness of the policy ties between the private sector and the government. And I think that there is a lot of frustration with that. I mean, I have a somewhat friendlier view of the Tea Party movement. I think that they were actually genuinely frustrated about a lot of this cronyism that they detected on Wall Street, this revolving door between successive, you know, Treasury departments of both parties and, you know, various large financial institutions on Wall Street. I think the difference between the right-wing Tea Party and a more left-wing populist approach to this was just that the, you know, Tea Party, you know, movement in its most libertarian form thought that, well, the problem is that we have been encouraging these tight relationships between the government and various parts of the private sector, and that kind of relationship never works out well for the little guy. And, you know, that's a legitimate point of debate. And I think that, you know, Thomas is absolutely right that that is something, that is a big conversation that we needed to have after the crisis and didn't. And if we had had that kind of argument, I probably would have enjoyed being on the opposite side from Thomas on a lot of these questions. But unfortunately, we never really got the chance.
And I think that you could encompass quite a lot of what you were talking about there in a word that Tony Blair used to love using, which was meritocracy.
Ooh, does that make me mad? Ooh.
It sounds like a positive thing, people being rewarded on their merit, but it really means a kind of academocracy where only the university educated and white collar people get to run the world. It's a kind of cognitive dictatorship. I mean, that strikes me as the real issue that's been in here in the UK. I mean, last week we did an event on Brexit, which talked about how this is 5 decades in the making. It's not just because of financial crisis, it's because of a whole lot of other things, including expansion of higher education and that so-called, that sort of leaning towards meritocracy.
That is exactly right. Are you addressing it to me, Mr. John Ashmore?
Yes, sorry. I'm alternating between panelists.
No, that's exactly the problem. By the way, I should go back and say that what Joseph was saying about Wall Street, he's right that there was something on the books called the Community Reinvestment Act, but it didn't require banks to issue fraudulent, fraudulent bonds to rip off, retirees in Dusseldorf or whatever. All of the efforts that the banks had spent in the last 20 years was to get themselves deregulated, which they had done very, very successfully, to the point where, like certain financial instruments, there was no supervision at all. But that is a story, that is an argument to have had in 2010. And Joseph is right, we never really got to have it. I used to write about this all the time when I was at the Journal. It was a great time to be writing about this stuff. But John, what you said is exactly the problem here in America. That just the other day, Joe Biden was giving gave an interview where and by the way, after we're done with this conversation, I'm going over to the polling place here in Maryland to vote for Joe Biden. So I say this as I suppose, a kind of, a supporter of his in some way. But he just gave an interview the other day where he was talking about, like, what's your model for how America is going to come back from this disaster? And he said, basically university-based innovation. And this is, all Democrats say this, we have these great universities and we can monetize their ideas. And they always say this. And if you push them a little harder and you say, well, what are we going to do about inequality in this country? They'll say, more education. We just got to get everybody into college, and they don't understand this is exactly the opposite of solving the problems of today, because the whole point of higher education in this country is to sort people out into a hierarchy, and the ones who go to the Ivy League universities, what you're sort of Oxbridge, what you would call, what I mean, they
Russell
are. Yeah, they're always at the very top end of the earners. So America is becoming more and more unequal because of meritocracy. It's not a solution to the problem. It's a way of brushing the problem off. It's a way of declaring that you don't have to, that this system is completely fair, is what it is. And there's this incredibly obnoxious side to it, which you also just put your finger on. And I'm reminded all the time of those debates back in the 90s over bank deregulation and over trade. I mean, the trade agreement arguments were particularly vicious, in which professional economists, and I'm thinking here of especially Paul Krugman, who's probably the most famous economist in America, if not the world, would be utterly contemptuous in public of people who didn't agree with them, and would forever pull academic rank on people, it was always came back to credentialism, always does. And this is, in my mind, this is the sort of overarching cultural problem of liberalism today. Look, I'm hearing it's this contempt for ordinary people, this contempt for ordinary voters, this phenomenon that I call anti-populism. And you see it all over the place in Democratic Party. When they talk to each other, you see it in their newspaper columns when they're denouncing Donald Trump. Maybe I'm sensitive to it because I'm from Kansas, but I've collected an enormous amount of these expressions of contempt. And they begin, of course, or they don't begin, but what would you say, the highest point in this is Hillary Clinton's famous remark where she called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables, which is just, the most incredible political blunder to say something like that in a democracy. And I think, there's, like I said, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples where you're kind of upper class, affluent winners, liberal winners, meritocratic winners, they love to shake their finger at people who vote for the other side. And this pandemic has given them just another, what we call COVID scolding or mask scolding. There's just like wave upon wave of scolding. And so the way I put it is that these people live in a kind of utopia of scolding, where they don't really, they're very affluent. These are the winners, right? These are the winners in our economy nowadays, the meritocratic winners that you're talking about. They're doing very well financially, and they live in these beautiful suburbs. I mean, I'm here in this area that's going to vote for Biden by probably 80 or 90%, surrounded by McMansions. I'm in the mansionization belt. They're all so sensitive, and they're so contemptuous of the other side, but it's a utopia for them. They're both doing financially better than anyone else, and they're morally better than anyone else. And so it's a utopia of scolding, and they really don't care if their side wins or loses. I mean, they'll be unhappy if Trump gets reelected, but he just cut their taxes. What do they care at the end of the day?
Joseph,
I want to jump in, if it's all right, John, and pick up on that morality theme that Thomas just raised, because that's actually where I locate the source of a lot of this problem, and why I think that populism, however you want to define it, seems to be giving everyone a bad case of the vapors right now. I think that the sort of cultural or political root of all of this boils down to this notion that there is a right answer, an objectively correct answer, and an objectively incorrect answer for every policy question that you could have. And so, I mean, we often talk about, our political elites almost being like a clerical class. And this is a big part of it. And I think that this is why the, going back to that Tony Blair quote that you started this, riff of the discussion with, that kind of thing comes from this notion that we have some sort of objectively obtainable correct policy answer to every question. You need the correct training in order to get it. And then there's this question of morality bound up into whether you will actually do it. So I think that a lot of this neuralgia that we suffer about populism and some of these popular revolts, and the reason why there is so much elite contempt for these voters who vote the way that their betters don't think that they should, is because we aren't thinking about the issue of tax rates or trade policy, or even sort of where in our public life we should mandate masks and which venues you should not go into, be able to avoid wearing a mask in. We aren't viewing those as policy questions in the traditional sense, where you sort of everyone evaluates their the evidence, and then you kind of haggle it out in terms of what is some halfway solution to this problem that is minimally acceptable to a majority of voters, and then that's what we're going to live with. No, I mean, it is freighted with this there is the moral way, and then there's the evil way. And I will use my university education to figure out what is the moral way. And then if you don't want to follow me along, clearly there is something wrong with you as a voter, and you belong in some kind of electoral medical museum as an oddity of some sort. And I mean, this is a real problem. And I would just finish by pointing out that, I mean, if you're talking favorably about populism, you're in danger of doing the same thing, because I think there's a strand to some of these discussions where you can go too far in the other direction and use populism as a term that tries to ennoble or privilege some voters over other individual voters, perhaps because they harken back to an agrarian nostalgia of some sort. In the case of the populists of the 1890s, even if they aren't actually a majority of the electorate. And then you're kind of freighting the morality discussion in the other direction. So, I mean, part of me wishes that we could get away from this entire discussion about populism as a term and think instead about some of these just being normal, de-catastrophized compromises that we're going to have to work our way through, and some people will win and some people will lose, and then there will be another election in 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that there are actually policies both in the US and in Europe that don't fit into a normal kind of left-right framework. I'm thinking about, say, quite technical stuff like planning reform, for example. House prices are a huge problem here. You wouldn't see that as particularly a left or right problem. I think there is an area that people can come together on once we've got rid of this sort of slightly hysterical tenor. Thomas, I just want to get back to the US election. You mentioned you're going to vote after the after this event. How much of the vapors that Joseph mentioned do you think are personally tied to Donald Trump? Or is it a bit of a chimera to think that if Trump goes, then this whole phenomenon will go with him? I mean, could Republicans have another Trumpian candidate in 4 years' time?
Well, the short answer is, of course they will. And by the way, this sort of thing is not, it's much worse now because of the COVID, because of the pandemic that we're in. So I wrote an article a while ago for Le Monde Diplomatique about the climate, trying to understand the sort of climate of fear and hatred that you see everywhere. And it's much exacerbated by social media, which is now basically our only way of talking to one another. And social media, at least in the sort of Twitter conversations that I participate in, so much of it is basically the utopia of scolding, in which one strong personality scolds everyone else, with the idea being that, it's this almost sort of hyper Protestant, and I say this as a Protestant, hyper puritanical way of judging everybody else, with the assumption that at the end of the day, there's going to be one person who's more righteous than everybody else, and that person somehow wins the cosmic conversation. One of the things that I love about studying historical populism in America is that there is another way. It doesn't just have to be, highly educated elites telling us what the right answer is and shaking their finger at us and ordering us to embrace their thinking on this, that, or the other. The populist idea, the populists were not hostile to learning or hostile to education. They were in love with it. But these were by and large not highly educated people. Most of them hadn't even gone to high school, but they loved the idea of learning. And they were devourers of books. It's the 1890s. That's what people did. They read newspapers. They would go to these enormous public gatherings that we think, when you know what the Chautauqua movement was? No way you would. You're in the UK. It was you would have huge gatherings of farmers out in a pasture somewhere, and then these sort of nationally known speakers would come and address them and talk about issues of the day. The populist idea was that America is a democracy. We live in a democracy, and we have to, if we want good policy making, the people have to be educated up to the point where they can participate in it. And here I've actually got some physical reminders of this kind of populist sensibility. This is the Little Blue Book series that came out of Kansas. These cost 5 cents a piece. It was very much on the populist model, but the idea was that the man who founded this publishing house, again, had not gone to college, was not a highly educated person, but was in love with ideas and with learning, and wanted to sort of kick down the doors of the meritocratic elite, that anybody who can pay 5 cents can basically get their hands on the same things that they're teaching at Harvard or Yale. And that was the populist idea. And what's sad is we have really left that behind. It's all about the sort of clergy of the highly educated, instructing the rest of us what to do and threatening us with damnation if we don't.
Yeah, I mean, that brings me on to, I have another question from the audience here. And Joseph, this is quite in your wheelhouse. It's to do with sort of monetary policy and banking, which is that Europe has suffered from the 70s oil banking crash, the ERM crisis in the 90s, the 2009 crash, the 2012 and 13 euro crisis, and now this massive recession we're experiencing now. I mean, why are central banks and governments so bad at learning antidotes to these failures? And is it linked to this kind of clergification that Thomas talked about just then?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is an element to that. I mean, my sense is that the monetary policy world in particular suffers for the fact that it is a very small world academically. It's very difficult for you to get differing viewpoints into that. I mean, in fact, I will admit that that was one part of Thomas's book that I found myself disagreeing with and being kind of puzzled. But I mean, I could understand in the historical context why the populists of the 1890s had opposed the gold standard, but knowing what we now know about how a clerical, technocratic class can really mess up your monetary arrangements, I think that actually the stability of some kind of gold standard starts looking a bit better for the ordinary person on the street. I think that, again, the problem, I mean, you run into a couple of problems. I mean, one thing that has happened over the past century, particularly since the progressive era and the rise of technocratic governance, is that we are just leaning on governments to do more. I mean, the quantity things that we want a modern government to manage or to monitor, to control in some way. I mean, they have to deal with monetary policy. You have to do exchange rates. We want our central banks to be responsible for various unemployment rates or economic growth figures. We want the government to manage the provision of free school lunches and social benefits, and also manage housing policy and house building. We want the government to manage transportation regulation, fishing rights, and all of these things. And I think that one of the reasons why this kind of elite governance increasingly fails and seems so disconnected from the interests of ordinary people is because the complexity that this relatively small set of bureaucrats and elected politicians, the complexity that this small group of people are asked to manage is just totally baffling. So of course they're going to end up making more mistakes than they will get things right. But you also have this political incentive problem, where I think that one difficulty that a lot of quote unquote populist movements run into is a certain amount of incoherence. If they are based on the frustration of a certain portion of the electorate, which might not actually, in fact, often is not a majority of the electorate, the frustration might very well be there, and for good reasons, but the specific policy targets might be poorly chosen. The Tea Party is a good example of this, where there was a lot of frustration about the debt and deficit that was created by the Obama stimulus bill in 2009. That pales in comparison to the fiscal crisis that America is going to face as the baby boomers start retiring and we have to pay old age benefits. But that was not the target that the Tea Party chose. I mean, even these conservatives in the American Tea Party in 2009 absolutely did not want to touch Social Security or Medicare, which are the old age pension and healthcare programs. I would argue that if the Tea Party's goal as a quote unquote populist movement was to try to restore fiscal balance, they chose the wrong target. And I think that kind of poor target picking, combined with all of these other problems that you have that are built into the nature of the administrative state and the mistakes that it's likely to make, probably explain why the track record in terms of success of some of these movements ends up being very mixed or kind of depressing.
Yeah, I mean, that brings us, we've got another question here, and I'll put this one to you, Thomas, which is, how does this anti-elite politics, how is it co-opted differently on the left versus the right? Because we talk about anti-elites, but really often it seems like a kind of war of elites. I mean, neither Joe Biden nor Donald Trump could really claim to be anything other than a member of America's elite, one a billionaire, the other the consummate Washington insider.
Yes, that's right. The way I look at it is that the two parties serve two different elites in America. The Republicans, of course, it's well known, that traditionally the party of business, more and more closely identified with extractive industries, oil, things like that. And the Democrats serve increasingly, they used to be very closely identified with organized labor, but now that's many decades gone. And they're increasingly identified with a different elite, which is people who, education-based meritocracy, people whose status is based on their, how they did in school. And so they identify, and there's all sorts of very interesting changes just in the last 20 years. Wall Street, which when Ronald Reagan was president was as Republican, and I'm talking about the US financial industry, as Republican an industry as you could find in America, has flipped and is largely, it's still contested, of course, but when the fundraising figures are out, I'm sure you're going to see that they gave more to Joe Biden than they did to Donald Trump. And the same with Silicon Valley, which, geez, just 20 years ago, remember George Gilder used to write those books about the libertarian nature of the microchip and stuff like that. And Silicon Valley is the great sort of expression of libertarian business, the business ideology. And they are, towards the end of Obama's presidency, his administration was filled with these guys from Google. Eric Schmidt, one of his chief economic advisors all along there. Today, the Democrats are incredibly close to the to Silicon Valley. And so I see the two parties as serving two different elites. Now, one important point here, and this is, if you look at American politics in the long term, the two parties are changing positions, or it seems like they are. The Democrats are, the elite that they answer to, the sort of knowledge-based elite, is obviously on the ascendant. The industries I just described are eclipsing the sort of old-fashioned Republican industries. And at the same time, the Republicans, who have been reaching out to working class people for years with, on their sort of Reagan, Nixon, anti-elite culture wars strategy, they've now sort of become the party of the white working class, and they are being dragged in that direction. It's absolutely fascinating what is going on in this country in the long term. And I think the day is going to come when the two parties have basically switched positions. Well, not really. I'm sorry, that's going too far, but you see what I'm getting at. Now, you want me to shall we talk about this election that's coming up?
We can. I just wanted to.
By the way, I should have said something else about what Joseph made a really interesting point about complexity. And there was this point, I like I said, I wrote this book about the Obama years, Listen Liberal, where I was absolutely struck by their love affair with complexity. These guys would go out of their way to make things more complex than they needed to be. Thinking of, one of the big reforms of that era that was the Dodd-Frank reform of Wall Street. And nobody knows what was in it anymore. It's completely forgotten today. But people like me were saying, you need to do, President Obama, do something really simple, like the old Glass-Steagall reform, which is just simply drew a line between investment banking and commercial banking, right? Or something similar to that, do something like that. And instead they developed the most complicated bank reform measure of all time. They were still drawing up the rules when Obama left office, and then Trump gets in and immediately, flushes the whole thing down the toilet. Or Obamacare, which is like nobody, not even the people who designed it, understood it. And we learned that this was done deliberately. And because there's a certain love of complexity among these guys. I mean, they would look at these financial instruments that the Wall Street people had been coming up with, and they would just, their hearts would go pitter pat. They were just in love with this stuff. Complexity.
I have to say, I felt like that when I looked at the NHS reforms in this country in 2011 as well. The organogram was more like a labyrinth. Joseph, we talked a lot about America here, but you live in the UK now. How analogous do you think our situation is to that in the States? We've had a study out yesterday that said that the culture war, for example, in this country is really a minority pursuit. It plays out in the media, but most people don't actually really sort of feel it at all.
Yeah, so what I found interesting about Britain, the main populist phenomenon, if you want to describe it that way, of course, has been Brexit, which we often talk about in the same breath as Donald Trump and various of the movements that were going on in the continent at the time. And, that's interesting because, Brexit is one of those few quote unquote populist movements I can think of that did actually get over 50% support in an election. Really, I think that the story of more of these movements is of a much more roundabout way, where the main attempt ends up failing in some way, and then little bits of the agenda eventually find their way into legislation a generation later, when you've almost forgotten how you started down that path. So Brexit is interesting from that perspective, but what I think is interesting is that shows that you can have a situation where if you ask people very starkly in a binary vote on a single policy position, you will get an answer. And then as you start trying to actually legislate that, and you do have to deal with the complexity of the real world, and the complexity of all of the things that the government is entwined in that are, involved in the kind of changing of a governing relationship of the sort that Brexit entails, you discover how difficult it is to manage a sort of political system that way. And actually how, I think that, at least at the beginning, the people who really seemed to favor the hardest form of Brexit, my impression was that they were kind of a minority. And then you've had a bunch of other people who supported Brexit if there was a trade deal of some sort, but then you had a lot of differentiation based on exactly what kind of trade deal people might want that would lead them to support Brexit.
Yeah.
And 5 years later, we still haven't counted all of the angels in the head of that head. And so I think that, and that leads to an interesting observation, actually, and I think that this might riff off of a point that Thomas was making a few minutes ago. I think that we also might, at some point in this conversation, need to be kinder to the elites, because I think that clearly you end up in the situation where they tend to go off and they do their own thing, and they have this undeservedly moralistic or clerical approach to policymaking, and the scorn for people who disagree with them, and contempt for the common man and woman. But the one thing that they are really good at is political compromise, and I think that. In fact, I wrote a column about this at one point a year or so after the Brexit vote. And the point was that, you'd had this vote that kind of defenestrated or disrupted a lot of the political class in this country. And it turned out that you got rid of or sidelined a certain number of the politicians who actually knew how you go about the business of achieving some kind of political compromise in the parliament or among the electorate that can enjoy that minimal level of support among a majority of the voters. And so I think that, the elites are still with us because they have figured out how to do that. And I would like to think that at some point, if you're going to have a successful populist rebellion of some sort, they are going to have to make that kind of compromise, because otherwise you end up in the situation where 5 years on, we're still kind of paralyzed by Brexit and not sure what is going to happen a month and a half from now, when the transition period ends. And you also end up in a situation where Trump, who is the great modern populist rebellion in America, the only policies he has actually been able to accomplish in a big way are things like tax reform that any Republican president would have been able to do. And it's because on a certain level, the elites did represent a political compromise that has some kind of persuasive power. So perhaps we should recognize that too.
We're just going to finish with another sort of audience question, which touches on a few of the things we've been discussing, which is what do we think the effect of a Biden victory would be on transatlantic relations, including on the various quote unquote populist regimes in Europe, Poland, Hungary, for example. Thomas, do you have a sense of a Biden foreign policy, or do you think he's going to be concentrating on making America great?
Yeah. I think it'll probably be very, very good for our relationship with the various countries in Europe, just because Trump has been such a jerk. Look, the thing about Trump is this election is a referendum on him, and especially on his how he's handled the pandemic in this country. Americans really don't vote on foreign policy questions unless there's a war on, and so that's pretty much off the table. There's not a whole lot of conversation about that. This election is about Trump, the pandemic, and the economy, and I think, and then to a lesser degree on the other side, it's about the sort of latest iteration of the culture wars, which is, so incredibly shocking and strange. What's going on here in America with there's this kind of radicalism among the upper class that has just absolutely carried everything before it here in the last couple of years. You look at the New York Times or the Washington Post, and that really rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And so that's basically all the Republicans have going for them, is this shock and horror at what we call wokeness. And but the Democrats are, nobody knows what's going to happen. Okay, this is because of these the mail-in ballots, because it's a pandemic. People are using the mail-in ballots all the time, and anything could happen with these. If you don't fill it out correctly, it gets tossed in the trash. And but if this was an ordinary election, I would say that Biden's pretty much got it in the bag the way things are looking right now, just because on the fundamentals, Trump is looking so awful. And also Biden is not Hillary. And this is an important point. Remember, we talked earlier about Hillary and the deplorables remark, and Hillary really did represent that kind of meritocratic democratic elite. You know, she was a super lawyer, and she and her husband were these brilliant scholars, and, you know, all this stuff. And you talk about quangos. She's a favorite of the nonprofit community. I went to one of her nonprofit events once. Biden is not that. Biden is old-fashioned. I mean, this is superficially here. Of course, he will deliver exactly the same thing as her, but superficially, he's a old-fashioned Democrat, comfortable speaking in a union hall, likes being around working-class people. You know, would never call someone a deplorable. He would never do that. That's just absolutely not who he is. And so much of that vote in 2016 was because Hillary was such a hated figure, and he is not. And so I think that's going to be dispositive this time.
Okay, so Thomas is going for a all other things being equal Biden win. Joseph, we've run out of time, but can I just get your, if I had a stack of dollars to my left and I wanted to put them on a candidate, where should I put them?
Well, I mean, look, my base case is still that Biden is going to win, but interestingly, over the past month, I keep seeing more potential pathways for Trump where it becomes possible to envision that he could end up eking out a win in the end. I mean, what's interesting from the perspective of this conversation is that if by some mischance Biden does end up losing the election, what we will probably look back on at the one sentence that did it is that line that he had in the debate last week about how he would end the oil industry. And I think that his campaign understood immediately what a terrible mistake he had made when he said that and tried to backpedal it. But I'm noticing that the Trump folks already are turning it into campaign ads in some of these swing states that have these oil industries that are employing a lot of blue collar workers, because it highlights this tension on the Democratic side between their more elite white collar constituency that has a lot of environmental concerns, and what used to be their blue collar constituency, who increasingly have been trying to shift toward at least Trump, if not all of the Republicans. So we'll see. Yeah. A week is a long time.
It's good. So
but it's like Hillary and coal. Do you remember? Hillary made the same mistake with the coal industry. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. So if it was the coal in 2016, to paraphrase the Sun in 1992, if Trump wins, it might be the oil what won it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I'd just like to thank all our audience for tuning in as well. And that is over and out. Thanks very much. Bye now.
Got it.
Bye-bye.